everyone, and welcome to the start of Season 2 of GSO Ocean Classroom Live. How great it is to be back and kicking things off with all of you again. Hello to our audiences on Facebook, on YouTube, Periscope, through Twitter, and all of our listeners, our podcast listeners. And as always, thank you to the Devereux Ocean Foundation for their generous support and funding today's episode. So my name is Holly Morin. I'm a marine biologist and a science communicator with the Inner Space Center at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be returning as one of the hosts for this second season of Ocean Classroom Live. If you tuned into our programs last year, welcome back. If this is your first program with us, welcome aboard. Our team is super excited to be exploring a variety of ocean-themed topics with all of you again. So just like last season, the goal of these programs is to share a lot of ocean knowledge with some fantastic content experts, but to also keep things really conversational. So your input, your questions are super important to the success of today's program. You can ask questions at any time during the broadcast. So you're going to put them into the chat feature that's right there below the Facebook video player or in the YouTube chat box if you're watching from either of those platforms. And then we'll try to get to as many of your questions today as possible. So we actually always like to kick things off with a question for all of you. You know, where are you watching from? What city? What state? Type it into the chat box feature there. Let us know. I'm in North Kingstown, Rhode Island right now. It's currently started snowing. So this should be an interesting rest of our day and see how much more snow we get. But let us know where you're tuning in from. While you're all typing in your answers, one quick reminder to follow the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography and the ISC on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all of our social media accounts so that you can stay up to date on these episodes and more. And if you happen to be watching a replay of this, fantastic. If you have a question, be sure to type it in and we'll monitor those and try to get to them as soon as we can and get you an answer. So let's see if anybody has put in their locations yet as to where they're tuning from. If not, oh, fantastic. So we have somebody who's coming in from East Greenwich, my neighbor. Perfect. From Rhode Island, somebody from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome. Hello from Greece. My goodness. Does it say Greece? Yes, it does. Hello from Greece. Goodness, we're international. Foxborough. Hi, Patty. Wonderful up in Massachusetts. And then Newport, Rhode Island, already shoveling. Oh, snowing here. I was going to say, Hannah, you're already shoveling. You guys got a lot more snow than we did. Up in Maine and Livermore, fantastic. We're spanning the coast here. This is great. So happy to have all of you joining us here. Miami Beach, I'm sure you're nice and warm. Although we are thinking of all of our folks and friends in Texas, right, as they're coping with snow and cold that they're not quite used to. But so glad to have all of you joining us today for sure. So today's Ocean Classroom, it's our first episode 1 of our 2021 season, and we're going to be diving into the topic of food webs. So perhaps you've heard of this term before, maybe not, but I think we all know that all living organisms depend on one another for food. So it's almost a century ago, 100 years, that Charles Elton in 1927 first explicitly defined the concept of a food chain in his book, Animal Ecology. So a food chain is a linear system or a chain of links showing how organisms are related to each other by the food they eat. And each level of a food chain represents a different level of energy or food transfer. Animals are classified by what they eat or where they get their energy. So maybe you've heard of terms like a producer. So a plant, they're producers. They get their energy from sunlight. Or consumers, they're going to be eating or consuming these producers. And then some consumers are eaten by other consumers. You have herbivores that only eat plants, or carnivores that are meat eaters. I always think of dinosaurs when I hear these terms. And then omnivores that eat both plants and animals. And all of these are important parts of a food chain. But in reality, just like that picture showed you, it's not usually just a simple linear chain. A lot of animals eat lots of different things, right? We all eat different things. So many food chains actually overlap and form a food web or a complex system of interconnected food chains. So food web diagrams, that's what that image just was, show all the different feeding interactions among species in a community. They describe who eats whom, and they help scientists understand how changes in the ecosystem, temperature changes, removing a top predator, increasing competition, how those things may directly or indirectly impact different species. So when we look at marine food webs in its simplest form, we're going to have plankton, algae at the bottom. They're going to form that really important foundation to the marine food web. And they're eaten by primary consumers like zooplankton, small fish, crustaceans, which are then in turn eaten by fish, small sharks, even corals, right? And baleen whales. And then we have something called top or apex predators. Those are your sharks, your dolphins, your billfish, your toothed whales. Humans are up there as well, okay? Some seabirds too. All of these organisms are connected in different ways with energy flowing in different pathways. And then actually humans actually consume aquatic life from every section of the ocean food web. So food webs are really one of the central themes in ecology. So the strand of science where we're looking at the relationships between organisms and their environment. And we're going to actually connect with two GSO community members whose research is steeped in this topic of food webs. Super excited. So Kristin Huizenga is a PhD student with Dr. Candice Oviatt here at GSO, and she's been looking at American lobsters in Narragansett Bay, their different life history stages, juvenile, almost combined there's juvenile, larval stages, and how changing water temperatures in the bay are impacting them. There are these stages. And then she's also looking at predator and prey interactions between young lobsters and then two warm water fish, so scup and black sea bass. So Kristin, why don't you say hello to our audiences and let them know a little bit more about your research.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today, Holly. I'm really excited to talk to you all about food webs. So my research focuses on, like Holly said, lobsters, primarily the younger stages. There's a lot of research that goes into the older stages of lobsters that I am familiar with, and a lot of you are familiar with from eating them on your dinner plate. This is one of my first experiences with lobsters as a kid. Every summer, we'd have a big lobster dinner. Often kind of by Cape Cod. So this is probably something that a lot of you are familiar with if you're in New England, and other places not so much. But when I came to GSO, what I learned was that we used to have a lot of lobsters in the Rhode Island fishery. It was a really important part of the fishery here. And in the last few decades, Rhode Island has not had that booming fishery anymore. Lobsters have not been doing well here. So we're really trying to figure out why, and my research looks at especially really young lobsters that are born either this year or the couple of years following the first few years of their life to see if maybe it's a little too hot here for them, or if we have some fish that are really increasing in the bay that are maybe eating all the lobsters before we can eat the lobsters. And I'm really excited to delve into that a little bit more with you later.
Awesome. Fantastic. So also joining us today is Matt Ramirez, who is a postdoctoral fellow in Dr. Keld McMahon's lab at GSO. And he is looking at how climate and fishery-induced changes in food web structure within the Western North Atlantic Ocean has influenced marine mammal and sea turtle trophic ecology over the past century, so from the 1880s to present. That was a really big, long thing to maybe summarize a little bit, Matt, about your research. And also maybe what is a postdoc? Because individuals may not have heard of that before.
Right. So at the most basic level, I study animals basically at the top of the food web. So mostly sea turtles and marine mammals at the moment. And I'm especially interested in understanding how sort of natural and human-induced changes in our marine ecosystems are influencing these top predators. So what they eat, how they grow, and how those sort of interact influence their population dynamics. So how animal populations change through time. And so here I'm really focused on the Western North Atlantic, which is sort of the coastal area from around North Carolina up to through the Gulf of Maine. This area has seen sort of unprecedented change over the past number of decades due to humans overfishing a number of fish stocks, but also it's one of the fastest warming areas of the world. And so I'm really interested in seeing how these two pressures are altering these ecosystems. We know they're having major changes on the composition of some of these ecosystems. And so I'm interested in seeing how those changes then sort of percolate up to the animals at the top of the food web. And yes, a postdoc. What is a postdoc? It's such a weird word. So I have basically ran out of school. I got my PhD last year, or 2 years ago at this point. And so I'm basically a scientist that's operating somewhat independently. This is another sort of training stepping stone period for me to learn new techniques and answer new questions under the tutelage of another faculty member. But it's sort of like a waypoint on my career. So next I'm trying to, at this point, become my own faculty member of my own.
Awesome. And I just realized in the way that we're all lined up right now, we actually have 3 different postgraduate or post-undergraduate sections foundations of maybe science, whereas I had my master's degree. I got my master's degree from Texas A&M. Kristin's getting her, working on her PhD, and Matt, you're a postdoc. So it's kind of nice to see us all an undergrad off to the next team to be good to go. And Matt, was this something when, I know Kristin showed her picture holding a lobster when she was a child. Is this something that when you were little, this was the path you were going to be on? I was a dinosaur kid when I was little. Marine mammals came maybe for me in middle school. But what about you? Was this the path you were on from the very beginning?
Absolutely not. But ironically, this is a picture of me with a sort of model of a shark jaw. But growing up, sort of the ocean was like the farthest thing from my mind. I lived a long time in Colorado and North Alabama, very far away from the ocean. I've always loved animals. I thought that meant that I was going to become a veterinarian, and I sort of started on that path. But then once I got into college, I became interested in research. And then actually it was after my undergrad that I got into doing sea turtle research and the marine world. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Great. So we want this to be a conversation. So we've been chatting it up, but we want to make sure we include all of our audiences. So remember to type in your questions or comments in that chat box at any time. And hopefully we got your juices flowing with this initial conversation, some initial information to be shared there. So if you're curious about, just like we were chatting about, academic career paths, experiences, different aspects of their research, maybe what they ate for breakfast this morning, since we're talking about food webs, any of those questions, we'll get to as many as we can. And I actually know that we have one question already initially. So Patty would like to know, what exactly is plankton? Is it an animal or is it an algae, or both? Who wants to tackle this one?
I could take that one. So Patty, you're right. A plankton is an animal or an algae. So it can be either. Basically, a plankton is a plant or animal that is bad enough at swimming that it gets kind of carried along by the ocean currents. So sometimes these animals are really, really small, like so small that you can't see them with the naked eye. But we also have jellyfish, which are plankton. And a lot of us have seen those at the beach, and those can actually be quite large. And then the other cool thing about plankton is that they can either be plankton for their entire lives, or also they can be plankton for just a little bit of their life and then become something else. For example, lobsters spend the first 4 to 6 weeks of their life as plankton. They're very, very small, and they get kind of carried around by the ocean currents. And then once they get large enough, they actually settle out of the water column and hide in rocks. And that is when they are no longer plankton. At the same time, you can have, the krill, or you can have copepods is another kind of animal that is a plankton that's really, really important for other animals to eat. And they are plankton their entire lives. They will never be anything but plankton. So that's a really good question.
And then fish larvae fall in that world of plankton as well, right? I love that way that you just framed it, Kristin, where some animals are plankton all their lives, and some of them are plankton while they're metamorphosizing into these, or changing into these other bigger animals. And so fish fall in there. I know crabs, and people also don't think of sea stars, they're plankton, correct? And then barnacles, all these interesting animals that we see on the beach that are actually started out of these really odd looking, teeny tiny organisms. Oh, what's this one, Kristin?
This one's a lobster, actually. So this is a lobster that I have caught. This one's pretty far along because you can see it swims pretty well, mostly in circles, but this is definitely a later stage lobster. And once it metamorphosizes like maybe 2 more times, it'll settle out into the cobble and hide in some rocks.
I think it just looks like a shrimp. And this is sometimes what happens is you look at something and you think it's one thing, but it's really another.
Yeah, it's very much like a shrimp structurally at this point.
So, well, they're related. So there's that too, right? So Matt, are food webs, are they all the same in the ocean? We have one global ocean technically. So are they different regions? I mean, what are some examples of food webs, and who are the key players?
Right. So food webs vary a lot all over the world. And some of the key factors that influence sort of the structure of food webs is structure itself. So nearshore food webs are really defined by sort of the rocks and algae and seagrass that's available. But coral reefs are a very different type of food web that are found in tropical areas. Arctic food webs are often defined and are anchored to sea ice and things like that. So marine food webs can vary a lot based on where you are in the ocean.
Awesome. Thanks. And then if you think about too, I always think when, you think about the polar regions and who the different players that are there. So what, Matt, when you mentioned, or I also mentioned it, apex predators. So who are some of our apex predators? So if I think in the Arctic, I'm thinking and have you'll have sea lions and other fishes or other seals and et cetera. So what are some other apex predators?
Sorry, I think I'm cutting out.
Nope, I think I cut out.
Or Holly's.
Live.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
yep, that's an example of apex predator.
I think
it was.
Yeah. So I think in the ocean, so in polar regions, apex predators in the Arctic are often polar bears, large mammals, killer whales, and things like that. In most of the rest of the ocean, we think of sharks and very large sharks as sort of the apex predators. But humans are also sort of an apex predator in all ocean systems because we have technology that allows us to catch basically anything that we want.
Awesome. So where you mentioned sea turtles, so we actually have a question that I think we're going to bring up. We're going to start doing something new with GSO Ocean Classroom, where we're going to have our video. We're going to start having video questions submitted in advance. So this question is from Regan, who I believe is from Lincoln, Rhode Island. So why don't we cue that up and play this question for you, Matt, talking about sea turtles.
Hi, my name is Regan, and I'm from Lincoln, Rhode Island, and I love sea turtles. My question is, what do sea turtles eat and what eats them?
Awesome question. Thank you, Regan. So Matt, what do sea turtles eat? Who eats them?
That is a great question. So sea turtles eat a number of things, but most of them are invertebrates, but it does vary by species. So there's 7 species of sea turtles. 4 of them are pretty generalist and eat a wide range of invertebrates, but they particularly like crabs. The 3 sort of unique species, the leatherback sea turtle eats mostly jellyfish. The green sea turtle is our herbivore and eats mostly seagrass once it's an adult. And the hawksbill sea turtle specializes on sponges, which are found in coral reefs. So it's a really unique sort of filter feeder in coral reefs. In terms of what eats sea turtles, when they're small, pretty much anything can eat them. So fish will eat baby sea turtles. Birds will eat baby sea turtles. But once they get large, pretty much the only predator are large sharks.
Awesome. Fantastic. And thanks again, Regan, for that great question. We keep talking about things eating each other, but often we have lots of organisms that simply fall, right? They either die or they're not fully consumed at the surface and they fall to the bottom. So what happens then when something in the food web isn't fully consumed? Kristin, is this where lobsters kind of come into play in a broader food web kind of idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So lobsters, as we know, live on the bottom. They'll kind of scavenge along a pathway, kind of depending on what kind of lobster they are. They can travel really far, or maybe they stay really close to their burrows, but they'll eat a lot of the stuff that they find on the bottom of the ocean. They also will eat things like mussels various times a year. So they don't just eat dead things that fall to the bottom, but they're definitely one of these kinds of animals that eats things that fall. Right now, you're seeing kind of a whale fall too. So this is a good example of other animals that eat things that have fallen to the bottom of the ocean and are dead. And this is especially useful in environments where there isn't a lot of food that's just produced down there. So in the deep sea, there isn't a lot of light. So we can't get those nice phytoplankton that we need to feed zooplankton, which feed fish. So they really, really rely on things dying in the surface waters and not getting eaten up there and to fall to the bottom. And if even some nutrients down there, if some of the animals aren't decayed down there, bacteria will eat it up and then they'll release nutrients. And then once you get that water stirred up, you can think of nutrients as basically plant food for phytoplankton. Once the water stirs that up, that just goes right back into the whole food web. So it's a good recycling system.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you. So if we're talking about food webs, they're not static, right? They change. And what are some of the, I think, Matt, you may have mentioned this a little bit earlier, some of the features that cause food webs to shift or change over time?
So in recent history, humans are sort of one of the biggest contributors to food web change, at least in really all parts of the ocean. So really over the past 100 years, we've started really ramped up our fishing pressure and our technology so that we can better extract fish and various resources from the ocean. And so that's sort of what's depicted here. if you think of like the far left, say like the 1950s, and the far right today, we've actually selectively removed a lot of the really large predatory fish that we like to eat from these ecosystems. And so it has led to very big changes in the composition in terms of number of species, types of species, and sizes of those species.
Awesome. Great. Okay, we're going to do a little like zigzag here. So you guys are going to zigzag with me because it looks like somebody has a question about Texas turtles, which I know is kind of really relevant right now. So they would like to know, there are thousands of frozen green sea turtles in Texas. This is what I thought this was going to be because I saw the image of the cold stunned turtles in Texas as well. Are they okay? And how will this affect the species? What a great question, because you're having this pulse of an extreme environmental event happening in a region right now. How does that impact not only the species, but then the rest of maybe that food chain or food web that is there, that exists in the Gulf?
Right. So what's happening is, so sea turtles are ectotherms, which means they can't really control their body temperature. The environment dictates that a lot. And so this really fast cold event happened. And what happens when it gets too cold, a sea turtle will basically stop being able to swim and will sort of float and then strand on the beaches. And so most of those are probably still alive and being taken care of. And they will be rehabilitated if they can, and then be put back into the ocean. However, these are natural events. But if they do sort of lead to the loss of life, that can have sort of major impacts on sort of the local community, because this is one of the largest cold stunning events in Texas history for sure. And sea turtles are threatened and endangered. So we want to do all we can to help rehabilitate these turtles, put them back into the ocean.
Yeah, we see cold stunned turtles, and my son was actually asking me, what is a cold stunned turtle? I'm like, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's gotten really cold. They don't regulate their body temperatures that way, and they just get super stunned because it's so cold, and their body functions just don't want to work the way that they should. We have cold stunned turtles, not in this number, along the Northeast coast as well, right?
Right. So it's pretty common actually up here in the Northeast, because in the winter, the water here is too cold, but in the summer, it's actually really good habitat for sea turtles. And so what they do is they migrate from North Carolina up the US coast to New England during the summer, but sometimes they don't migrate back in time, or especially if the temperature changes really quickly. And so that will lead to the cold stunning that we see up here.
Sometimes happens too, I feel like, when beluga whales kind of wander too far north and get out of their natural habitat as well.
Right.
Got to make sure. Same thing. They're like, oh, the water was really warm when I followed it up here, and now it's not so warm anymore. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to zag. We zigged, now we're going to zag. So we are talking about different changes in food webs. Actually, this was a great example of an environmental influence that may impact, if only temporary, the different players in the Gulf Coast or that region's food web. But human impacts. So we were talking about fisheries changes. Kristin, what other, maybe even in Narragansett Bay, if we spin it locally, what other potential human impacts are there that can impact a food web?
Yeah, so part of that is you can have pollution. For example, there was a really large oil spill in Rhode Island in, I believe it was 1996 or 1997. In lobsters in particular, lobsters like the smell of oil, so that resulted in the death of many, many lobsters.
Wait, lobsters like the smell of oil? Because I love when I learn something new. I did not know this.
Yes, lobsters love the smell of oil, maybe because it smells like decaying things. So instead of running away from the oil, they ran towards the oil, which killed them, unfortunately. So when you get pollution kind of like that, that can impact it. Something else that really happens that Matt was talking about a little bit earlier was like the kinds of fish that you fish and how that impacts what those fish eat. So for example, codfish is it's why we have Cape Cod. It's been a really big fish for humans for a long time, and we overfished codfish. Now, up in the Gulf of Maine, when the codfish disappeared, lobsters did not have a lot of natural predators. They could do really well there. But down here in Rhode Island, where it's warmer, they have some more natural predators that can eat those earlier stages. So you can see the dark parts on this map are actually where we have lobsters settling now, and that's further up north. So that's another way you can impact it, but also the different ways that we put things into water can impact our fisheries. So when we burn coal, that releases mercury into the air that makes its way into the ocean and then into our fish. It's one of the reasons we try not to eat too much tuna, is because we don't want to eat the mercury that we have released into the air. And then microplastics, fish eat microplastics, and then other fish eat those fish. And then they get all those microplastics in them too, and then we eat it and we eat the plastic as well. So there's a lot of different ways that we can impact kind of what different food is available to fish in the ocean, but also what we end up eating as well. So we really have to be careful about how we tinker with these systems.
This is a perfect segue into, looks like we have actually a question about microplastics. So Elizabeth would like to know, what impacts are microplastics having on our food web? So Kristin, you just kind of mentioned that fish can consume microplastics. How does, though, if a fish is consuming it, how does it then impact humans, or how does it move its way through the food chain?
Yeah, so what happens is when you get these microplastics in the water, a lot of microplastics will actually break down in the water into smaller bits, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get them out of the water. And animals at different levels of the food chain end up collecting either more or less of these microplastics. Smaller ones will eat those microplastics, but if you have another fish that eats a whole bunch of those smaller fish, it'll then consume all of the microplastics that were stored in each one of those fish. And then as you can see kind of from this graphic, then a seal will eat the larger fish and it gets all those microplastics from those larger fish. And suddenly the seal has way more microplastics than any of the tiny, tiny fish at the beginning of the food chain did. And then if we're not going to eat the seal in most cases here in Rhode Island, but if we eat a larger fish, we can eat those microplastics. You also get situations where, you just get animals that will eat plastic and then they can't digest their food or get the nutrients out of it as well. So this is actually a really big problem that I think we're just beginning to pull apart.
Yeah, it's one of the word I always use. It's bioaccumulation, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're accumulating stuff up in your biological systems as you move up those different levels in the food chain. So great. Not that that's great, but that was a fantastic description and answer to that question. So really quickly, one thing I personally wanted to get into with both of you is, you're studying different species and how or different groups, different levels of the food chain, and how you are going about studying these different features. So Matt, you're looking at stable isotopes, which folks may or may not be familiar with. And I know it's a really complicated topic to try to get into, but what does a day in the life of stable isotope, work look like? How are you getting your samples and how are you analyzing them?
Right. So at the most basic level, I'm studying the elements that are in an animal's tissues. And because I'm doing a sort of historic ecology project, I'm working with specimens that are from museums and research archives. And so this picture here is actually the Smithsonian. They have giant warehouses of marine mammals. And so those are whale vertebrae. And I think that's a bowhead whale skull in the front. And so they have specimens that go back decades. There's even some dolphin skulls that I have been sampling that are from the 1880s. And so what's really cool is that the isotopes in their bones are sort of a environmental record that can tell us what they were doing, where they were living, what they were eating back in time. And so a day in the life of somebody who studies stable isotopes involves first collecting sort of a tissue sample, often from a living animal, but then doing a lot of lab work. And so a stable isotope is basically just a different form of an element that if we think about the nucleus of a carbon atom, there are protons and there are neutrons. Different elements have different number of protons, but different isotopes of the same element have different number of neutrons. And so it gives, here on the right is carbon-13, and on the left is carbon-12. And it gives that extra neutron gives that isotope a slightly different mass. And it turns out that additional mass gives bonds between those isotopes a little bit, allow them to have stronger bonds that then impact how they move through the food web. So as it works out, the heavier isotope tends to concentrate in animals as you move up the food web. So if you think about you as a human eating a steak, that food will have a certain ratio of the two different isotopes, carbon or nitrogen-15 and nitrogen-14. But the nitrogen-15 is selectively retained in your tissues such that that ratio is higher in you than it was in your food. And so we can look at isotopes in that way to understand how animals are foraging in the food web.
Great. That's great. That was a really great explanation. Thank you, Matt. And then Kristin, your methods are a little bit different with how you're studying lobsters and sampling them. So why don't you let folks know a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my methods are a little bit more just like experimental, put things in tanks and see what happens. So one of my first experiments was actually looking at how temperature impacted juvenile lobsters. So these are the lobsters that are just a couple months after hatching from their eggs. My first experiment, I put them in basically their own containers because, fun fact, lobsters that are together in captivity will actually eat each other. It's why when you go to the grocery store, they all have those rubber bands on their claws. It's to protect them from each other. But I raised them in basically different temperature conditions, some that mirrored kind of the water temperatures that we see in the bay, and some that are colder, kind of like we would have seen in the bay many decades ago. And what I found was that these lobsters in the warmer water temperatures, the ones that are in the bay now and potentially in the future under climate change, they didn't grow as quickly. So these were lobsters that I was feeding every day, checking on, measuring. And even though they did okay in the water, they just didn't grow as much. And that actually can leave them open to predators for longer. The smaller they are for a longer period of time, the more kind of variety of things there are to eat them. So knowing this, basically we did this predation experiment with scupping black sea bass. We had these tanks at GSO, which were wonderful. And we set up these boxes of cobble. So cobble is this rock habitat that lobsters really like to hide in. And we put these really young lobsters in those boxes and placed them in the tanks. And then we would put either scup or black sea bass in those tanks, or just lobsters, and then see how many lobsters we could find at the end of them if the lobsters could successfully avoid these hungry black sea bass. So these are some black sea bass here. They tend to swim around kind of in groups. So if you're a lobster and there's a black sea bass, chances are there's some others nearby. So basically, I was kind of seeing if the lobsters could stand up against these fish. There is a lot of evidence, both from fishermen talking about getting black sea bass in their traps for lobster, and also in some other studies to suggest that these fish are pretty aggressive predators of lobsters, and that is what I found in my experiments.
Awesome, thanks. We actually have a follow-up question for you from Shane, Kristin. Shane would like to know, do lobsters eat meat?
Yes, lobsters do eat meat. In fact, meat is a really essential part of a lobster's diet, especially in New England. In fact, we kind of like to joke that lobsters, they're wild animals, but we kind of like to joke that they're captive because fishermen so aggressively fish for lobsters that lobsters eat what we give them through a very big part of their life. When you put a lobster trap out, fishermen put little fish in them. This is a young lobster, by the way. He eats plankton. But very hungry. When we catch lobsters, they have to be a certain size. We don't want to catch them too young because we want them to be able to have babies once before we catch them. So in the meantime, lobsters are small and they'll keep crawling into these traps and eating the fish over and over again. And as long as they're small enough, or they'll either escape or the fishermen will throw them back because they can't keep them. But that means that basically through these first few years of their life until they're about 6, which is about when they're old enough that we can eat them, they're just eating fish from these traps. So this is another way that we kind of joke that like humans are really supporting the food chain. Lobsters will eat dead things that they find on their own and they'll eat fish. But yeah, they especially eat fish when they find them in lobster traps.
Awesome. All righty. So we've actually approached our 30-minute mark. It always goes fast, these ocean classroom programs, and Matt and Kristin have offered so much great information. We kind of knew going into this that this was going to be a really fantastic first episode because it was just a lot of great information to cover. Really quickly though, I know we had one question just to wrap it up. It was about a career path, and I always like to highlight these questions because they are important. And I think somebody had a question about dolphins. And so they love dolphins and want to specialize them. You know, what is the best field they should study? Matt, if you want to, I can weigh in on this as well. But I don't know, Matt, if you have any insight being somebody who's kind of studying marine mammals in your work right now.
Yeah, I think a good place to start is going into marine biology generally, or even ecology or biology. But your degree in particular doesn't dictate fully like what you can do. So my undergrad, I studied squirrels. I studied terrestrial small mammals. And then afterwards, I decided to study sea turtles. So in the end, gaining research experience for me just in general helped me down the path I am. But if you're interested in dolphins in particular, going into marine biology is sort of a good first step because then it will allow you to potentially go into any number of paths, research, animal training, going on to being a dolphin vet. It's like so many different ways you can go in studying dolphins. I don't know if Holly, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I mean, that's a pretty great place. That's kind of what I would say too. And when we round out our classroom events, we always like some homework. So maybe your homework is go dabble. I tell people to dabble. You may love dolphins, but kind of expand your horizon a little bit, right? Look at all marine mammals, read up on them, see what different opportunities there may be. I know when I went on a whale watch, that was my trigger. I liked dinosaurs forever. And then I saw a humpback whale breach on a whale watch. I took a picture of it with an actual old school still camera. And that was it. And I ended up going to Newland Aquarium. I did internships there because I grew up in Massachusetts. But I did a lot of work when I was in my undergrad in the lab. I learned that my eyelashes are too long and my eyes are too close together for me to really look at a microscope for long periods of time. But I did it because I wanted to see, what I liked and what I didn't like. So figure out what you don't like. Maybe you really, really love dolphins, but you don't want to know about their physiology and their insides, and that grosses you out, right? So you'll figure that out. Dabble. So additional homework for everybody today. There is an art competition that the Graduate School of Oceanography is currently hosting. So their Ocean View art competition, and the link should be shared in the comment boxes for you all. And this competition is looking at what does the ocean mean to you as a Rhode Islander. It's for K through 12 students in Rhode Island. And it's exploring all the ways that we're connected to the ocean, just like a food web that we've been talking about today. So commitment forms are due by March 1st. Again, the link will be there for you in the comments, so definitely check that out. Another homework assignment, per se, Matt and Kristin, that we had was looking to purchase or eating sustainably caught seafood. So where does this come into play? Do either of you want to comment on this and, with regards to food webs and how that's connected?
I can start. I'm sure Kristin will have more to add. We've talked a lot about how fisheries can impact food webs. And a lot of the impacts have come from sort of unconstrained fishing and removing basically all the fish we can catch and all the animals we can catch to eat. However, we have now developed ways of fishing the ocean that are sustainable, which means that we leave enough animals in the ocean so that the populations can stay healthy. And so there are different fisheries. I think we provided a link through the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch. They will rate fisheries and specific fish on how sustainably they're catching those food items for humans. And so it's good to always try to choose seafood that has been caught sustainably to know that you are having a positive impact on those ocean food webs.
Great. And Kristin, do you want to add to that?
I think Matt did a great job. I would just say kind of a good practice, if you want to feel kind of where you are in the world, is to think about what you're eating and also what eats what you're eating and what that's eating. It kind of like helps me, at least when I think about the impact that I'm having on the environment and where I am when I'm interacting with the bay and everything around me. But I think Matt has wonderful suggestions. The Monterey Bay Aquarium has made a really comprehensive list that's super helpful when making decisions. So
great. Thank you. Thank you, Matt and Kristin, for taking time today to share your knowledge, your experiences with everyone. Thanks to everybody behind the scenes that makes these Ocean Classroom programs run. And be sure to check out all these resources that have been listed in the comment boxes, and including, I think that the website or the list to Monterey Bay will be included there for you all to check out further. Thank you again to the Devereux Ocean Foundation for their support. And thank you to our audiences today. You were fantastic and had so many great questions. Thanks for taking the time to join us, and hopefully you'll join us again in the future. So we have episode 2 is going to be coming up, Ocean Classroom Live. So that's going to be on Thursday, March 4th at 12 p.m. again. So mark your calendars, and we'll be talking about marine pollution and microplastics. So kind of going further into more detail about something that we touched upon earlier in today's episode. And if you want to mark your calendar even further out, our third episode will be on March 18th, and it'll be diving into the topic of ocean exploration. So pencil those into your calendars. Definitely check out all the resources and different websites that are listed there in the comments for more information. If you have additional questions, you can definitely follow up with all of us. Put those into the chat boxes after the fact, and continue to follow along with URI, GSO, the Inner Space Center, and all of our social media handles. Stay tuned for those future events. And if there are other topics that you'd like us to talk about, definitely let us know. I think there's a feedback form that will be shared for all of you to complete. complete if you'd like. And otherwise, again, Matt, Kristin, this was awesome. I now know that lobsters love the smell of oil. That will be the little factoid that I file away. This was fantastic. We really appreciate you taking the time. Be well, stay safe in the snow in general. And otherwise, thank you so much. Have a great one. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.